All right, so today in class, this is Wednesday, September 23rd, we finally started talking about arguments for God's existence, where we demonstrate the synergy or the complementary nature of faith and reason or faith and science, given that we can utilize reason and science in order to create arguments for God's existence. The first thing we're going to talk about is the Kalam cosmological argument. Now, I'd remind you that cosmology is the study of the nature and beginning of the universe. It's within metaphysics, so it is a worldviews question or set of questions. In this case, we're using the Kalam form that, interestingly enough, means we're talking about a form of the argument that comes to us through Arabic and specifically Muslim scholars. Now, they were introduced to the argument via Christian scholarship as they sort of swept across North Africa and into Southeast Europe. They came into contact with lots of Christian scholars, mostly in places like Alexandria, Egypt, where Christian scholars had really kind of started to gather very early on in the church history. And so they got introduced to the cosmological argument that way, and then they gave us a twist, which I'm going to point out what it is. It's a very simple argument. It is A, everything that begins to exist has a cause. B, the universe began to exist. Therefore, C, the universe has a cause. Very simple three-step argument, which a lot of these are. They are what you call syllogisms. A syllogism is a type of argument that basically is formulated this way. It says, if A and B, then C. This formulation of logic actually comes down to us from Aristotle, and they're very simple laws of logic that say basically, if A is true, and B is true, and C follows from those truths, then you have established a new truth. You've proved your point. So A for us is everything that begins to exist has a cause. That's actually what makes this the Kalam form of the argument. That is to say, it inserts this idea of beginning to exist. Because actually, as Christians, we believe that there are things that exist that didn't begin to exist. For instance, we would say God exists but doesn't have a beginning. We might even say certain characteristics of God exist and don't have a beginning. For instance, love, because we believe that love is ultimately rooted in the character of God. We would say love has always existed. Love is eternal. So we don't want to say everything that begins to exist has a cause. We don't want to say everything that exists has a cause. We want to say everything that begins to exist, so that we don't get this mixed up with whether or not God needs to have a cause. Now, if we were to look at this argument and maybe begin to push back against it, as a non-theist might want to do, what you would do is you would begin to push against A or B. You don't interact with the syllogism by looking at the conclusion. You interact with the syllogism by looking at the premises. And historically speaking, the premises, the premise that is much more controversial historically is actually B, the universe began to exist. And that's what we basically covered in class today, is how could we defend this premise? Because somebody might say, no, the universe doesn't have a beginning, it's past eternal. Now, you're very unlikely to find somebody who would say that today, but you would very easily have found somebody willing to say that 100 years ago or 200 years ago. And once upon a time, the whole conversation regarding the cosmological argument came down to premise B. Did the universe begin or not? Many of the ancient Greeks, many Eastern scholars emphasize the idea that the universe is past eternal. So what we would have had to do in the meantime is try to defend the idea that the universe has a beginning, that it's not past eternal. Once upon a time, maybe 100 years ago, slightly more than 100 years ago, we would have been almost entirely reliant upon philosophy to defend the idea of a finite universe, meaning a universe that has a beginning. We would have used philosophical arguments like this one, the Grim Reaper paradox. The Grim Reaper paradox, to be clear, is actually a new formulation of an old idea, but it goes something like this. The Grim Reaper paradox is that we are to imagine a room full of infinite Grim Reapers. And of course, the Grim Reaper's job is to usher people into eternity, into death. And so what we're supposed to imagine is that there's a man who's close to death. It's 11 o'clock at night, and he's scheduled to die at 12. And so the first Grim Reaper in line says, listen, if he's not dead by midnight, I'll take him to death. And everyone says, okay, fair enough. But then a second Grim Reaper stands up and he says, no, why wait till midnight? We could do this at 12, so we could do this at 11:30. I'll cut your time in half. If he's still alive at 11:30 p.m., I'll take him on to death. And the third Grim Reaper steps up. He says, don't be silly. Why wait half an hour when we could do this in half the amount of time? If he's still alive at 11:15, I'll usher him into eternity. And so forth and so on. An infinite amount of Grim Reapers step up and say, if he's still alive in half that amount of time, I'll take him on to death. Here's the paradox. We could actually divide time in half for infinity and never be done dividing time in half. You could always make your decimal point smaller, the fraction of a second even smaller than it was before by half as much. And so in this sense, the man who is scheduled to die will never die, because Grim Reapers for eternity will be dividing time in half and deciding who is it that should take him on to eternity. On the other hand, he clearly can't survive, because there are an infinite amount of Grim Reapers ready to usher him into eternity. So the paradox is that this man is both eternal and also will never survive. And what we're trying to prove here with the Grim Reaper paradox is this simple principle: that while eternity is conceptual or possible conceptually, past eternality is possible in theory, it is not possible in actuality. That as a physical phenomenon, time cannot be eternal. Eternity must be outside of time. Therefore, the time-space continuum that is our universe cannot be past eternal, because time cannot be physically past eternal. Eternity can only exist outside of time. And so what it seeks to prove is to say, you can't speak about past eternality with any sort of coherence. There must have been a beginning. An easier one, the race. Actually, this is one I came up with on my own when I was thinking through a different illustration. But here's what I want you to picture. I want you to picture the idea that there are two people who are about to begin a race. And let's say that they're about to start the race and that the starting line represents the beginning of time. And I also want you to imagine a finish line, whereas the finish line represents the moments that we call now. Here's the problem. What if the starter of the race actually asked the two people who were about to race to move back a step? Every time they were about to start the race, said, simply move back one more step. And it seemed over and over that they were getting ready to start, but they just never did. They always moved one step further back. That is to say, the race never started. But if the race never starts, it can obviously also never end. Which is to say, if there's no beginning of time, then philosophically speaking, we should never have arrived at the moment that we call now. That time is impossible as a phenomenon if there's no beginning point. If the race never starts, it can't finish. So this is the sort of thing that a philosopher might do to say, listen, I know there must have been a beginning of time, because if there's no beginning, there can be no end. One more is called the problem of the borrowing lender. What I want you to imagine is that somebody approaches you and they say, listen, I need $5. I need $5 because I need to put gas in my car. Okay? And you say, I'm sorry, I don't have $5. But later on, you see them and they've driven somewhere and they must have had gas in their car. You say, oh, where'd you get the money from? And they, oh, well, I borrowed it from a friend of mine. And so you go to that friend later and you say, well, what happened? You had $5 and you gave it to this person for gas? That's cool. It's very nice of you. And the person says, well, I didn't have $5. What I did is I borrowed it from my friend. And you say, oh, interesting. And so you go to that friend and you say, you had $5. It's so nice that you gave it to this other person so that they could give it to the driver who could eventually drive his car because he had gas in it. But what you need to imagine is, what if this phenomenon of the borrowing lender went backwards for all eternity? An infinite amount of people saying, hey, I need to borrow $5 so I can give it to this other person so that eventually we can get it to that original person who needed gas in their car. We know that there's gas in the car. We know that the person is driving. Therefore, we know that $5 must have arrived. But what that means is there must be someone in the past who had $5 to give. We couldn't have an infinite regression of people borrowing money. Somebody somewhere had to have $5 so that it could be passed forward in order to get to the person who needed gas in his car so they could drive to work. Well, that being said, what we end up with is a very clear implication that if we have arrived at now with this much energy in the universe, and we've arrived at now with this much life in the universe, we can't have an infinite regression of causes. There must have been a beginning point at which someone somewhere had the ability to put the universe in motion. If there is no one who has this ability to put the universe in motion, we would never have arrived at now with the possessions that we've got. These are just philosophical ways of saying there must have been a beginning point. We can't have an infinite regression of causes. Time cannot be past eternal, or else we would never have arrived at now. But they're much more likely to talk about science these days. It's much more common to say, well, I have scientific reasons to believe that there's a universal beginning point, a beginning point of the universe. First is the second law of thermodynamics, the implication of which is that the universe is slowly running out of energy. The second law of thermodynamics implies that if the universe was past eternal, we would have run out of energy by now. We would, in fact, not have a universe at all, because if the universe runs out of energy, then it becomes merely cold and dark and can't support life. But here we are with light and heat and life, which means that there must be a moment in time that the universe began, because we haven't yet run out of energy. If the universe was past eternal, we would have run out of energy by now, according to the second law of thermodynamics, which says we're slowly running out of energy. Therefore, the universe must not be past eternal. Secondly, we can observe what's called the red shift. And the red shift is basically, if we look through a telescope at objects that are distant enough, we can see essentially a blur. Just like if you had a camera and you took a picture, but were moving as you took the picture. In that picture, what you're seeing is both where the person ended up, but also where they started when the picture was being taken. That is to say, the blur represents movement. It's the same thing when we look through a telescope. What we're seeing with the red shift is the evidence of movement in our universe. Not just orbits, but the fact that all things are moving further apart from each other at a rapid pace. Or I should say all sets of things. Galaxies are moving further apart from one another. Solar systems even. And so the red shift proves that the universe is actually expanding in all directions all the time. But if we were to rewind the tape of the universe, what will we find? If we went backwards in time, that was expanding, contracting actually to a space-time singularity, which is to say a beginning point of the universe. This has been observed starting with Edwin Hubble in the 1920s, and moving forward, we can observe that the universe is expanding, and therefore, if we rewind the tape of history, it must have had a beginning point. More than that, we can also utilize this theorem of physics by Boord, Guth, and Vilenkin. And the Boord, Guth, and Vilenkin theorem basically asserts, and proves, I should say, that any universe that has on average throughout its history been expanding must have a beginning point. Now, I can't begin to tell you how they prove this. All I can do is tell you that they prove this. Boord, Guth, and Vilenkin are world-class physicists still working today, and their work has been peer-reviewed ad nauseum. And what they have been able to demonstrate beyond any reasonable critique is that if a universe is on average expanding, it must have had a beginning point. Our universe, like the redshift shows us, is expanding. It is on average expanding, therefore it must have a beginning point. In fact, we can even see evidence of that beginning point. Something that I'll have to add into this PowerPoint before I load it is that there is something called cosmic background radiation. Essentially, if we look at the universe through a thermal lens, or a lens that can detect energy and heat rather than just light, what we're able to observe is actually the radiation left over from the moment of the beginning of the universe. That's what we would call the beginning, as in the creation of the universe. We could still see the energy left over from the massive energetic explosion of creation, something some people might call the Big Bang and we call creation, the universe had a beginning.